Okay, hi everyone. My name is Edouard Morena. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of London Institute in Paris. So I'm Paris-based, but my employer is in London. I'm going to finish your week, I guess. I don't think you have anything after this, right? Hopefully not. Okay. But at the same time, it is probably one of the worst times to do any presentations, I have to say, like 4 o'clock on Friday. I think you're all thinking about the weekend right now. So I'm going to try and draw your attention to my research and to my presentation today, which focuses, as you can see in the kind of the subtitle, on management consultancies and their involvement in the international climate debate. And I'm going to focus more specifically on one consultancy firm, which is McKinsey and Company, which you've probably all heard about already. And so I'll be talking a bit about that in a minute. But just before I do that, maybe I'd just like to begin by just briefly contextualizing, let's say, my work on consultancies. The work that I do on management consultancies actually kind of falls into a bigger interest of mine, which is in studying what I refer to as climate elites. And by climate elites, basically what I'm referring to are kind of a group of people that are very much involved in the international climate debate. So they gravitate in particular around the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They attend COPs, so they attend the COP negotiations. They work in non-governmental organizations. They work in think tanks. They are communications experts. They are what are sometimes referred to as thought leaders. They are also, as we'll see, involved in consultancy firms. And so these are kind of people who are actors of the international climate debate, but they're maybe less kind of directly visible. You know, when we think about international climate negotiations, we sometimes tend to just simply associate those negotiations with states, with governments negotiating amongst themselves. But while I'm interested, obviously, in the role of states and intergovernmental discussions and negotiations, what I'm also interested in are all the people that kind of gravitate around these intergovernmental negotiation spaces. So the people who kind of facilitate these negotiations, the people who communicate about these negotiations. And what I'm interested in particular is looking at how these actors are maybe less visible, as I say, that some of the actors that we tend to see when we, look at a news report on television on the COP in Belém, for instance. I still consider them to be really essential when it comes to shaping the international climate debate. And so that's what I've been kind of focusing on for the past, I would say, more than 10 years now. I've focused in particular, initially kind of my interest was really centered on one actor in particular, and that was philanthropic foundations. So I did a lot of work on the role of philanthropy. And having worked on philanthropy, then I ended up working on other actors that are, in many cases, funded by philanthropic foundations involved or engaged on climate. So that's just to give you a sense, just a little bit of the context around this particular work. Another kind of element of context, which I think is also important for me, and which kind of relates to this work on what I refer to as climate elites, is also how these climate elites have tended to kind of collectively push a very specific understanding of what needs to be done to address the climate issue. And there's a lot of literature that kind of refers to concepts like green capitalism, climate capitalism, sustainable capitalism. So all these terms, essentially, they revolve around the same kind of ideas. This kind of ideas that capitalism, while it is responsible for the climate crisis, it can also be reformed. And it can also act as a very efficient instrument through which to address the climate issue. So broadly speaking, the actors that I'm interested in all kind of share this same idea of what needs to happen. They all kind of promote in one way or another this idea of a reformed capitalism, but still capitalism. This kind of idea that capitalism can be reformed and can drive the low carbon transition. So again, what interests me is how, the role that they play in kind of normalizing this idea that, essentially, green capitalism is the solution to the climate crisis. Okay, so that's kind of another part of what kind of I'm interested in looking at. Now, zooming in on management consultancies, why am I interested in management consultancies, and why am I interested more specifically in the role of McKinsey and Company? Well, I mean, I guess first of all, one of the reasons for me why consultancy firms are important is, and especially why McKinsey is an important actor in the international climate debate, is because precisely, there has been a certain amount of interest in consultancy firms, and more specifically in McKinsey, and in its responsibility in the climate crisis. And so here you can see there's a picture of Extinction Rebellion campaigners. So this dates back to February of last year. Essentially they were protesting in front of the McKinsey and Company offices in London, so the headquarters of McKinsey in London. And as you can see, based on what's written, they're kind of criticizing, they're accusing McKinsey of kind of fueling the climate crisis, in particular through the work that they do for a number of kind of fossil fuel interests. So the fact that McKinsey, that McKinsey's client base includes, most of the largest emitters, in the global economy, is something that has been highlighted by Extinction Rebellion, but it's also been kind of highlighted by other activist groups and other NGOs. So there has been a certain amount of interest, let's say, on behalf of NGOs, but also on behalf of investigative journalists in the kind of the ties between McKinsey and fossil fuel interests, and the ways in which McKinsey has, as a result of those ties, also contributed to worsen or to deepen the climate crisis. So obviously that's, for me was kind of interesting, but at the same time, what I find particularly interesting with that is that essentially what we see here is only kind of part of the story. And when I say it's only part of the story, what I mean is that what I found was missing in many of these campaigns or many of the reports that we were seeing on McKinsey and its involvement, let's say, in the climate debate, on the side of, in particular through this focus on its connections with fossil fuel interests, is that it completely sidelines the fact that, based on my own observations, in particular through work that I did around the COP21 back in Paris, but also before that, COP15 in Copenhagen, what I was seeing is that, yes, McKinsey was kind of serving fossil fuel interests, but it was also serving actors who were pushing, what we could term a pro-climate agenda. So they weren't just on the side of fossil fuel interests, so they weren't just pushing, at least, on the face of it, kind of an anti-climate agenda. They were actually also, through work that they were doing for a range of other actors, pushing what we could consider, again, at least on the face of it, as kind of a pro-climate agenda. So they were also actively supporting various kind of international organizations, governments, but also processes such as the UNFCCC, and the COP process, they were actually also involved in that process, trying to advance the climate agenda. So again, that's what kind of struck me, is the fact that we weren't really looking at that side of the McKinsey story, or the McKinsey climate story, as we could call it. So that's kind of what I want to focus on today. So my idea today is not to say, it's not to just kind of, well, focus on McKinsey as, McKinsey's work for kind of fossil fuel interests. I'm not going to look at that today. I'm actually going to focus more on McKinsey's work in favor, let's say, of climate action. Now, before I do that, and as I say, what I'll do is actually I'll focus on a particular moment, and in particular, the moment leading up to COP15 in Copenhagen, which was kind of an important moment both in the kind of climate governance, the history of climate governance, but also a very important moment for McKinsey. Before I give you kind of more details on how McKinsey was involved in the international climate debate, I'm going to just also say a few words about methodology and I guess the challenges associated with working on management consultancies and more specifically working on McKinsey. So I've already said this is kind of my broader area of interest. But if we look at existing research, okay, this should be fine. I didn't finish the sentence at the top. But basically, if you look at existing research, I mean, if you look at the bodies of work on kind of climate governance today, you'll find very, very few, if any, at least in particular when it comes to international climate governance, you probably won't find really anything of substance on management consultancies, and even less, I would say, on McKinsey's role. So there was clearly for me, when you're an academic, you're always looking for kind of gaps in the research, to fill. And for me, there was clearly a gap there. There was nothing really on the role of management consultancies, and more specifically, the role of McKinsey in the international climate debate. There were, as I said before, a few press articles, books, by journalists. But as I said, these tended also to focus very much on, McKinsey's work for fossil fuel interests, McKinsey's kind of anti-climate, you could say, agenda. There were a few reports as well by NGOs, NGOs like Greenpeace, the Rainforest Foundation as well, back in, it was around 2010, 2011, they produced reports that kind of looked at McKinsey, but again, these reports tended to also focus on very specific issues, and they were very much focused on the work by that McKinsey was doing around tropical forests and the REDD mechanism, which is maybe something you have or may have not heard about, which was kind of a big thing back then, and which was centered on this idea of preserving forests while at the same time reducing carbon emissions. But again, it's just a handful, let's say, of reports by NGOs that focus on that. Now, there is, however, a much bigger body of research that actually focuses on professional services firms and consultancies. It's actually also a very useful body of research that I'm also very much kind of using in my work. But again, within that broader body of research, which is usually kind of associated with the field of kind of management studies or also critical management studies, what you find is that very few academics working on consultancies are kind of interested in kind of climate or climate-related work. Only recently have we started to see the kind of the first, I would say kind of real academic publications that seek to kind of try and develop this kind of sub-area of work around consultancies. I'm thinking in particular of the work of Rosie Collington, who she co-published a book with Mariana Mazzucato on consultancies. It's called The Big Con, where she has a whole chapter on climate change and kind of the role of consultancies in the climate debate. So I encourage you to kind of look at that if you're interested. And more recently, she also co-published a short article, which was kind of a review article on climate consultancies as well. So we can see that there is kind of a beginning, the beginnings of kind of an interest, again, in particular amongst scholars who work in the field of things of critical management studies, on the role of consultancies in the climate debate. But it's still very, very early days. So I didn't really have much to kind of build on, let's say, in terms of existing academic work. Now, will this work? That's better. So just to summarize this kind of research, again, limited research on McKinsey and climate change. There's a tendency to focus a lot on the links, as I said, between McKinsey and fossil fuel interests. Limited focus also on the firm's unique internal structure. And that's, again, something that I find quite interesting when looking at existing work, in particular on McKinsey, by academics, but also by non-academics. There's this kind of tendency sometimes to present McKinsey as this kind of coherent whole. When in fact, and this is something that was very visible in my own work, what characterizes McKinsey, and this is also how a former McKinsey consultant put it, is that they say McKinsey is anarchy. It's basically this kind of idea that within McKinsey, from the moment that you're a consultant within McKinsey, and even more so if you're a partner at McKinsey, you have a lot of freedom to work on whatever you like. You can work on really any issue area. The main thing is that at the end of the day, it brings in clients. It brings in money to the firm. So for me, that's really essential in understanding why within McKinsey, certain consultants decided or that it was worthwhile to work on climate change, both for personal reasons, and again, I think that's something that we shouldn't kind of underestimate or push to the side. They're not just people kind of looking to make money. Sometimes consultants, they also do actually want to work on topics or issue areas that they are concerned about. And again, in the interviews I was able to do with former McKinsey consultants, that's something that came up quite a lot. So there was a real commitment, let's say, to the climate issue. But at the same time, obviously, another dimension is that many of these consultants also saw the opportunities associated with work on climate change. The fact that climate change, given that it was becoming this kind of major issue that was really touching on absolutely everything, they saw the opportunity also to develop expertise and to sell that expertise, and to kind of position themselves within this kind of broader, these bigger debates around the low carbon transition that were, particularly important, in particular in the 2000s. I mean, you could say that today it's maybe slightly less the case, but at least until the kind of the re-election of Donald Trump, climate change and this idea of like the low carbon transition, that was a very kind of central topic. It was something as well that governments were also putting a lot of money into. Think of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars being invested in the clean energy transition. So all that money also obviously generates opportunities for private actors, for companies, for investors, but also for management consultancy firms. And within McKinsey, as I say, as we'll see, some consultants saw that opportunity, saw that there would be a need for expertise to support, to accompany corporations and governments as well in kind of planning the low carbon transition. So again, what's for me really important and what I found was slightly missing in a lot of the text that I was reading is that this needs to also consider the firm as an organization, but also as a group of individuals, a group of individuals with individual aspirations, and a certain degree of individual freedom as well to engage on different issue areas. Oops, sorry, I'm coughing in the microphone, which is not a good idea. So at the same time, the reason why a lot of the research that I was reading, or at least that's the impression I was getting, why research on McKinsey tended to present the firm as this coherent whole, it partly has to do, at least that's my hypothesis, with the challenges associated with researching these types of organizations. From the moment that you have a black box in front of you that you have difficulty in opening, you'll tend to present it as a black box. And so what I was interested in is to try and find ways of opening the box, of trying to understand these internal dynamics, trying to kind of break down who was doing what within the firm and who was working on climate change within the firm. So, that was really the big challenge for me, and I think it's a big challenge for anyone trying to do research on these types of organizations, and in particular on McKinsey, is actually being able to access primary sources, but also access current consultants. I sent many emails asking for interviews, and every time I got the same response when I got a response, which was that they couldn't answer my questions. And various arguments were put forward to justify their reluctance to grant me any form of access to their internal documents as well. So to address that, what I did, and I did this with a colleague, Svenja Kiel, who's based in Monash University, who's also kind of working with me on this project on McKinsey, is that we explored the possibility of using freedom of information requests to actually access internal documents, to access primary materials. And are you all familiar with FOI requests? Yeah, more or less. I mean, it's something that tends to be used a lot by journalists, actually, to be able to access information. So what we did, we used this to access government records, and in particular, when governments worked with McKinsey on climate-related issues. So we targeted the Danish government, the Norwegian government, the US government, and the British governments. And the reason why is that we already identified that McKinsey had worked with these different governments, particularly in the period leading up to Copenhagen. So back in 2009, we knew that McKinsey was involved with these governments, with actually specific ministries within these governments. And therefore, we made a series of freedom of information requests to kind of the national kind of authorities, and we requested any kind of documentation relating to McKinsey's work on climate change with these governments during the period basically from 2007 to early 2010. In parallel to that, we also conducted a series of interviews with former consultants. So it was actually easier to speak with former consultants because they were no longer employed by McKinsey. But also people, so individuals who had interacted with McKinsey consultants during that time period that I mentioned, 2007, 2010. And the idea was to use the interviews and the FOI request and to kind of basically use the interviews to refine also our requests, for our FOI requests. And on the back of that, to use the information that we gathered through the FOI requests to also interrogate or ask more specific questions to the people that we had succeeded in kind of contacting and who were willing to speak to us. So that was the kind of the method that we came up with. With all the challenges again associated with that. The first of which, and I don't want to overly criticize my own institution, obviously, because it pays my salary, but it was actually quite challenging even within my own institution, for my institution to allow me to do this. And that's kind of interesting because I think it relates to the broader issue and the broader challenges with the study of elites. It tends to actually be easier to study normal people, and quote unquote, than elites. They're always a bit worried or scared when you say, I'm actually going to do research on McKinsey. And so that was actually a first barrier that we had to cross internally, to be able to convince our own institutions that this was a worthwhile project. But again, I had to go through a very, very long and tedious process in order to get them to accept that I engage in this research. Another challenge, obviously, is the time it takes to access the documents. The fact that when you request documents through the Freedom of Information process, it takes a very long time. It takes a very long time for governments and bureaucracies to process your request. Sometimes they're also very reluctant to send you information. Therefore, you have to have, there's a lot of backwards and forwards, a lot of conversations that need to be had. And ultimately, sometimes they send you documents, but also what sometimes you end up with are super highly redacted documents that are also very difficult to exploit. And interestingly, you also see major differences between countries. If you look at the case of Denmark, or Norway is probably the best of all, in the sense that you just have to email them literally through kind of an online database, and they send it to your email directly, no questions asked. Denmark is actually also quite transparent, but then when you look at the UK or the United States, it's another story. It's much more difficult to access their information. And in fact, for the UK and the US, we're still waiting to receive anything from them. So there were a lot of challenges, but it was still worthwhile, we feel, because it allowed us to access a lot of archival documents, emails, PowerPoint presentations, various internal reports, et cetera, and that allowed us to kind of reconstitute the kind of story of McKinsey's work in the lead up to the Copenhagen COP. Just another thing, and this is maybe what I find the most, this is maybe why I'm spending a bit more time on this question of methodology, and why I think it's interesting, is that in a way, you could say that this kind of unwillingness, reluctance to communicate, to cooperate on behalf of governments is in itself very instructive. It actually tells us a lot about the function of consulting firms, especially when they do work for governments. Essentially, what governments are paying for is for the discretion that they provide. You could say that consultancy firms, and this is something that Ludek Stavinoa explains very well in his analysis of McKinsey's role in the European Union's management of refugees, is that essentially, what they provide is that discretion. They act as this kind of firewall, in particular between academics, journalists, or anyone who wants to learn more about, the inner workings of government, or plans around questions around kind of refugee management, for instance, but also around climate change. They serve that purpose as acting as kind of this barrier, between you and policymakers, or those who are kind of developing policies. So as you write, as Stavinoa writes, outsourcing of knowledge, what they serve. Their role is of outsourcing of knowledge production to McKinsey had the effect of partially taking the contested implementation of the EU-Turkey deal, which is what they focus on, out of the public realm, and thus beyond public scrutiny, and to obscure the bureaucratic irregularities at play. And so again, I think that's interesting because it points to that other function, let's say, of consultancies, especially when they work for governments. They're not just there to provide expertise. In a way, they're also there to provide cover, to provide discretion as well. And so, again, that's also, for me, what makes them so interesting to analyze, even though it is very, very difficult. So just to illustrate this, what I'd like to do for the rest of this presentation is just to focus on, the case, the moment that I'm particularly interested in studying with regards to kind of McKinsey's climate work. I mean, I could have chosen other moments, I think even more recent. You probably can find some more recent examples of McKinsey working on kind of climate change. Providing assistance in particular to governments, hosting COPs, for example. But for me, the Copenhagen COP is a really important moment in the sense that it's really what kind of turned McKinsey into a major player when it comes to climate governance, or at least it's really what kind of propelled them onto the international stage, essentially. Before Copenhagen, McKinsey was practically inexistent when it came to climate change. They were inexistent when it came to their work on climate change for companies and the private sector, but they were also largely inexistent when it came to their work on climate for national governments and international institutions. So COP15, from that perspective, was particularly important. And the reason why I put this title, the McKinsey COP, also relates to their function and the work that they did. And again, this is still kind of work in progress, but our hypothesis is that the work that they did was not just kind of providing expertise and support, is that in a way they also contributed to shape the outcome of the COP, and that's in particular what we're trying to clarify. Now I don't know how well you know COP15, and if it kind of rings a bell, in terms of like why COP15 is kind of an important COP in the history of the international climate process. But, just to summarize, you could say that there were a lot of expectations in the lead up to COP15. COP15 was supposed to deliver a new international climate agreement. So this was in 2009, but it actually ended, what many considered, well, most interpretations of the COP would argue that the COP was a failure. It wasn't able to deliver this new international climate agreement, and therefore we had to wait until COP21 in Paris for that international agreement to finally emerge. So as I say, COP15 is usually remembered as this massive failure. But what's not as remembered when it comes to the COP is the particular role that was played by McKinsey during that COP and in the lead up to the COP as well. And so here are just a few kind of quotes from people that I was able to interview. And again, for me, it was really interesting because they all kind of point to this idea that actually, McKinsey, which again, if you read any article or any book, I haven't found one yet. If you can find one that refers to McKinsey, let me know, but I don't think any refer to McKinsey. I haven't read any kind of academic account of the COP that refers to McKinsey. But what these individuals I was able to interview kind of point to is actually that for them, McKinsey was actually quite an important player in the COP process leading up to Copenhagen, so 2009. So as in the first quote, former senior official at the UNFCCC, he writes, "My recollection is that McKinsey paid by the European Climate Foundation, paid in turn by ClimateWorks, which is another philanthropic foundation, worked with the Danish presidency of COP15 and the US delegation to write the Copenhagen Accord." So what he's actually stating, which again for me was particularly interesting, is that they were directly involved in drafting the Copenhagen Accord, the draft text that was supposed to be negotiated. This is something that I haven't been able to prove in any way until now, but that's definitely something that I'm kind of interested in looking at, because essentially that would imply that McKinsey had also a responsibility or a direct responsibility in the failure of the COP itself, because they were involved in the drafting process. Another, interviewee that I spoke with talks about the fact that, McKinsey, he says, McKinsey consultants produced a set of highly influential analysis, generating a shared understanding, particularly of an agreement on mitigation and finance. Their work on climate finance notably influenced the Copenhagen outcomes and post-Copenhagen financial decisions. So what they're saying here is that, the McKinsey seemed to have played kind of a role in creating kind of a shared understanding, of what was possible and what would be required in order to address the climate issue. So again, for me, that's very interesting because it also points to the particular role of management consultancies as these kind of intermediaries between a range of different actors, private, public. They're kind of at the at the crossroads between these actors, and therefore they also play this facilitating role. They serve that function of, creating common understandings, creating common grounds, creating common ways of interpreting particular issues and problems. And finally, a former negotiator said to me that the Danish Prime Minister's office that was kind of responsible for organizing the COP in Copenhagen allowed McKinsey to access the very heart of the engine room, a consulting firm whose political orientation is well known, far removed from the interests of developing countries, and let them draft the crucial documents. So again, he's referring to this idea that McKinsey was actually involved in the drafting process. But also, and this is another element that's important, that they were pushing a very particular understanding of what was required that was very northern-centric, that was not serving the interests of developing countries. So it wasn't, they weren't pushing for an agreement that served all parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. They were pushing for an agreement that was very kind of lopsided, that was mainly kind of serving the interests of the US that was referred to earlier, but also other kind of industrialized countries. So again, these oral accounts, these oral memories of McKinsey's involvement, or at least that highlight the fact that McKinsey was very much involved in the COP15 process, I find absolutely no trace whatsoever of it anywhere else. And again, for me, that was particularly interesting, intriguing, and actually quite destabilizing as well, I have to say. Because when you're kind of doing research and you find nothing in the secondary literature on your object of study, but people are actually telling you that actually, yes, they were there, they were important, and they did play a role, you start to ask yourself kind of questions, like kind of serious questions as well. You start to even doubt about what you're doing. Nevertheless, I was able to kind of reconstruct the history of their involvement. And again, I think what's important is to try and situate their involvement within the broader context of the time. And in particular, when as I said earlier, when you think of consultancies, and why they engage on a particular issue, it has largely to do with opportunities, with the fact that there are opportunities to expand your client base, to gain new contracts. In the early 2000s, you could say that the context was particularly favorable for the development of climate consultancy. Why? Because, as I say, there were all these conversations around the need for a new agreement in 2009 to replace the Kyoto Protocol. The climate issue itself was gaining in centrality. In 2006, I put the French title here, but there's An Inconvenient Truth, which you may, again, or may have heard, this is where I feel very old. You probably don't know what I'm talking about, but it's a very famous documentary by Al Gore that came out in 2006, which was really, really important because it was the first time that what was essentially a PowerPoint presentation by the former Vice President of the United States became this big phenomenon. People went to the cinema to watch someone do a presentation on climate change. There was Hurricane Katrina, and how that was also important in also generating more kind of interest on the climate issue. Late 2008, the victory of Obama, who was on a very kind of pro-climate, with a very pro-climate agenda. If you look at McKinsey itself, the McKinsey at that time was also hit by a series of scandals. So its kind of public image was very negative at that time. It was associated with the collapse of Enron in the early 2000s. So its reputation was very poor. And so, again, by working on topics like climate change, it could also hope to improve its public image. And what we also see during that time is that McKinsey in the early 2000s starts to really take an interest in working with governments, but also with NGOs and foundations. They see NGOs, foundations, but also governments as kind of a really important potential kind of new source of income as well. So all these kind of factors are important to consider when kind of understanding McKinsey's engagement in the international climate debate in the lead up to Copenhagen, in 2009. But I guess what was really key in kind of accelerating McKinsey's and increasing McKinsey's involvement in the international climate conversation, and what was also key in turning it into this kind of central actor in the international climate debate, is a curve that you can see on the right, which is called the marginal abatement cost curve, which is something that they developed. Actually, I'll talk about it in a minute, but the cost curve is something that they've created for a number of different sectors ever since the 1980s. But they developed one specifically on climate change. And so essentially, the idea through this cost curve is to look at the abatement potential associated with specific measures or technologies, and to look at both the potential in terms of abatement of CO2 equivalent per year, and associate that with a particular cost. So look at the cost of each of those technologies as well. So look at their potential in terms of abatement and look at their relative costs. And so visually, you can see it's something that's very powerful in the sense that on one page, you have this kind of two-dimensional rendering that says, that gives you information on the cost, so the financial cost, but also the potential of different technologies. And so essentially, that image, that curve, you can use it as the basis for policies and low-carbon growth plans, for example. So they came up with this curve specifically on climate change, which was actually they were actually recycling something that they had originally developed back in the late 1980s when they first began to work on environmental issues. And again, that's something that's very interesting with McKinsey, is the kind of the institutional history and the fact that they keep trace of all that they have done, and they build on that constantly. They recycle things that they already did, and they update them, and they repackage them, and they sell them to new clients. And that's precisely what McKinsey's Stockholm office did in 2006. They produced a report that was paid, obviously, for Vattenfall, the Swedish energy company. And they came up with this new version of the cost curve for Vattenfall. And on the back of that, having produced this first cost curve, then they started to sell it to a range of other clients, private companies. Everyone wanted their own cost curve. And the reason why is, again, you have to place yourself in the lead up to Copenhagen. The fact that everyone, there were a lot of expectations associated with Copenhagen. Everyone is expecting a new international agreement to emerge. The climate issue was everywhere. Everyone was talking about climate change, and therefore corporations, private companies, increasingly felt that they also had to come up with a low carbon strategy. Okay, and so McKinsey was there with their cost curves, and they sold their cost curve to a range of different clients, and they adapted the cost curve to sectors, to countries, etc., etc. So as this former consultant said, everyone started looking for new countries, NGOs, and companies that might be interested in developing cost curve. In 1 or 2 years, billions, I quote, of cost curves were developed for cities, countries, industries, for practically everyone all over the world. Some were paid, others were free. It was all the rage. And so again, you can see how this really connects with the role of McKinsey in creating this shared understanding. The spread of the cost curve. Through the cost curve, they were essentially promoting or pushing a very specific understanding of the climate issue. A very specific way of framing the climate issue and the solutions that need to be pushed forward. Try and move a bit faster. So this was 2006, 2007, and this is, I guess, an important moment as well. This is when McKinsey, this is kind of McKinsey's first kind of foray into the negotiation process. So 2007 and the COP that took place in Bali, COP 13, is the first time that we see McKinsey consultants in the list of participants in the COP. So it's the first time that you see McKinsey consultants attending an international, a UN climate conference. And on the back of that, what we see is, from 2008 onwards, and at least until COP15, essentially what we see is that in addition to producing cost curves, McKinsey is now also more directly involving itself in the climate negotiations process. And it does that in particular through philanthropy. And this kind of connects to my earlier work on the role of philanthropic foundations. Essentially, in 2008, they receive $50 million from philanthropic foundations to engage in the international climate process in order to kind of facilitate or create the conditions for an international agreement in Copenhagen. And so that takes the form of a project which is called Project Catalyst. And McKinsey, which involves not just McKinsey, but other think tanks and actors in the international climate space. But essentially, Project Catalyst is really important because it marks McKinsey's, I guess, entry into climate negotiations, essentially, because that's when they start to really engage with the UN climate process. And again, what's interesting here, and this kind of relates to my earlier point on the fact that McKinsey, talking about McKinsey is not enough. You need to look at people within it, and it is actually the story of people, of a group of consultants within McKinsey. And I guess the most important of those consultants within McKinsey is Jeremy Oppenheim that I mentioned here. He was the one who kind of coordinated McKinsey's work on climate change, and he is the one who also coordinated Project Catalyst, and who was therefore very much involved in the negotiations process as well. Now, as I say, if you look at how Project Catalyst presents itself, it tends to present itself as this kind of answer machine, this idea of we're only here to produce technical expertise, but actually it did more, it did much more than that. And this is just an extract from a slide deck that I was able to obtain through my Freedom of Information request. As you can see, it's also about engaging with kind of what they consider to be the key players in the international climate process. And so that includes policymakers, that includes negotiators, it also includes representatives from NGOs, from the private sector, and essentially it's this kind of idea of bringing them together, creating kind of a space of dialogue, and through that creating the conditions for kind of a shared vision of what needs to happen or what could be a positive outcome at COP15 in Copenhagen. Now, what's interesting, if you look at the list of people, is that it's overwhelmingly people from the so-called global north. So that's, I guess, another interesting kind of dimension of Project Catalyst, is that it is a project that is very much oriented, or that is very much dominated, let's say, by northern interests. And so, as I say, what's interesting to see is how Project Catalyst, was involved in developing and employing a specific strategy around COP15. But more specifically, in the case of Project Catalyst, what's also important to note is that Project Catalyst worked very, very closely with the Danish Prime Minister's office in the lead up to COP. So they had very close connections with the presidency, the incoming presidency of the COP itself. Okay, so just to give you a sense of the proximity between McKinsey and the international climate process, and in particular the presidency of the COP. So again, I won't go into all these details because we're running out of time, but I think I've shared my slides. And as I say, I guess this is just to summarize on Project Catalyst. What's really kind of interesting for me is to see how McKinsey was, at the heart of the negotiation process. And again, what's even more interesting for me is to see how they were at the heart of the negotiation process, but no one refers to them as being in the heart of the negotiation process when you look at the history or the stories, the stories that are told of the COP process itself. So it's very difficult to find any trace of McKinsey in any kind of publication on the Copenhagen COP. Very quickly, on the back of COP15, and this kind of connects to the earlier point that I was making, what's interesting to also note is how COP15, although it was a failure, and in a way, although McKinsey contributed to the failure of COP15, it was nevertheless able to capitalize on that failure, funnily enough. So on the back of COP15, people like Jeremy Oppenheim that you can see here, they really became kind of key figures, and they still are today. They became key figures of the international climate conversation. They were involved in a series of other initiatives after the COP, such as the Global Green Growth Institute, that brought together a number of former McKinsey consultants that still exist today and that's based in South Korea. But they also set up their own specialized consulting firms. So Jeremy Oppenheim, for instance, set up his own consultancy called Systemic, which is still exists today. Material economics, vivid economics. And the funny story is that actually some of these consultancy firms were bought up by McKinsey as well later on. So McKinsey consultants left McKinsey, set up their own firms, and 2 or 3 years ago, McKinsey bought up the firms and reintegrated them into the firm. Another element, and I'll finish with this, is that in a way, what's for me kind of interesting with McKinsey and this kind of the studying of McKinsey's work in the lead up to COP15 is that in a way it kind of provides kind of a slightly different story of the COP15 process and the international climate governance process more generally. And again, it's a story that clashes, or that, that doesn't necessarily clash, but that sometimes is slightly different to the ones that you hear. Including stories by former negotiators. So here you have an example of Todd Stern, who was kind of a key US negotiator for many years. He published a book, I think last year, Landing the Paris Climate Agreement. At no point does he refer to McKinsey. He talks a lot about COP15. At no point does he refer to them. So it's kind of a different take on the COP process. And it's also a take on the COP process that, in a way, allows us to better understand, how the COP, as I said at the very beginning, it's not just about governments. It's not just about negotiations between parties, so governments in particular, but it's also about these other actors that are maybe less visible, but that contribute to create, or at least that attempt to create, these kind of shared understandings of the climate issue. And as a result, contribute also to normalize certain solutions, certain approaches to the climate issue, to the detriment as well of others. And that's another story, but that's also an important element, I feel, that needs to be looked into. Okay, I think I don't know how long I've been speaking, but okay, all right, cool, thanks.